All right, guys. So the purpose of today's class, and really today's classes, so we'll do this in two chunks, is to give us an overarching understanding of the events of the First World War. We won't be able to look at all the different aspects, but we'll sort of understand the story of the First World War, and then I hope that will be a frame that you can use to come back and attach other pieces of knowledge to it. So later we'll come back and we'll put on a purely economic lens onto the war, and then we'll watch how economics develops across, right? We'll come back and we'll put a purely technological lens. We'll see how technology impacts the practice of the war. We'll come back, we'll see how the war impacts people at home in civilian populations, all right? But I think we need to have a solid framework specifically in the events of the war. So we're really just looking at the political and the military events. And what I'd like to do this morning is I'd like to look at the political and military events that occurred in 1914, 1915, and 1916. And then in the afternoon, we can come back and we can do the events which happened in 1917 and 1918. All right. So we'll be able to layer it all in, and we'll have a deep understanding. Right? If you have any questions at any time, just interrupt. All right. Because if this was just supposed to be me talking, I would just have made a video. I've also given you a reflection sheet, all right, which has space for you to reflect on each year after we do it. The purpose of this is so that you remember things for the first time. Right? So with some of you, I've made this analogy that remembering something is like walking through snow. The more times you walk back and forth, the easier it is to get from one place to another. So we're just going to walk through the snow once after each year to begin to pack down the snow. I realize not all of you walk through snow regularly, but when you're hacking through the Amazonian jungle, the more times you go, is that more persimmons? There's nothing to do. When you're taking an Uber from, all right. So what I first would like you to do then with your reflection sheet is just here where it says the Great War, all right? I would like you just to remember what you can remember. What are our two sides in the Great War, all right? Okay, and so, and I think that the way that we can divide that up then is we can think of the Entente, okay, and the Central Powers. Right. One mistake that I find students sometimes make is I feel like they refer to the sides in the First World War by names that were much more familiar from the Second World War. They use the word allies when they're talking about Britain and France, for example, and they use the word Axis when they're talking about Germany. Those are Second World War terms. So let's focus on the Entente, right, and the Central Powers. Right? Central because they're in the middle. Right. So I would just like to give you guys 5 minutes then to think and reflect on the sides, okay, and what you can remember about the sides in the war. Yep.
Is it just like the sides in the beginning?
Yeah, you could think just about the beginning, because as we need to add people, we'll add people as we go along.
Wasn't it something like Axis?
So that's what I was saying is the Axis, that's in the Second World War. Nothing to do with the first. So leave that off.
Can we put Serbia with
And then if there's anything else you want to remember in this section of kind of that will be important for pre-war knowledge, that will be important for the actual practice of the war, that's great. Yep.
Is it Romania that fights with the Central Powers?
Not initially. You said Central Powers, right? Does anybody need a copy of the text of the reader?
No, I don't know.
Yes? Okay.
Italy at the start of the war.
Is not involved in the war. They're neutral.
Yeah, they're neutral, but then do they go with
You came to the right place. Well, I'm going to tell you the whole story of the war, right? So, last one. Could you hand that back to us? Okay.
You said that Bulgaria will be from the war on the side of the Central Powers?
I'm sorry?
You said that Bulgaria will be from the war on the side of the Central Powers? Weren't they Russian conquest?
No. Remember in the Balkan Wars, there's a struggle between Serbia and Bulgaria, and so it's not possible for both of them to maintain client state status.
Did like the Ottoman Empire decide the Ottomans didn't fight?
They did fight.
But wasn't it dissolved? Or did it stay in Constantinople?
It dissolves after. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry. And anything you want to remember that you think is important for the start of the war. All right.
Yeah, it was the Ottoman Empire. Because I mentioned
Right, because
they
the
beat
second
the
part.
Greek.
We don't want to stop time. Okay, I'll give you guys one more minute to finish that up, and then we'll get started. All right, so hopefully we remember enough about the start to think in the most basic sense that we have Germany and Austria-Hungary, right, involved in a war against Britain, France, Russia, and Belgium, right? Those are going to be our major constituents, all right? After the start of the war, we're going to have the Ottoman Empire is going to come in on the side of the Central Powers. So if you want to think about them as being involved in the Central Powers from the beginning, that's fine. Oh, and I left off Serbia. Sorry, poor Serbia. Serbia is also obviously fighting on the side of the Entente. All right? Italy should have, by treaty obligation, gone in with the Central Powers because it's part of that triple alliance, but it stays out of the war. All right? And so it will get involved in the war, as will other countries that were involved in the Balkan Wars. Romania will enter the war. Bulgaria will enter the war. Greece will enter the war. All right? But for our purposes, we're going to focus ourselves then on the Western Front, right? Which is going to be German soldiers fighting against Belgian, French, and British soldiers. All right? Then we're going to look at the Eastern Front, which is going to be German soldiers fighting against Russian soldiers, Austro-Hungarian soldiers fighting against Russian soldiers, and Austro-Hungarian soldiers fighting against Serbians, right? So if that's our initial setup, we'll complicate that, all right? As the war goes on, we'll see more fighting outside of the sort of European theater. And we'll actually do a whole class where we look at, well, what happens in Africa, what happens in Asia. But for today, we'll focus on, some people call it the European sphere, even though some of it takes place in the Middle East. Some people call it the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean kind of touches on, right? But I think you have an idea then of, it's almost like this map was made for the work that we're doing, all right? Because this is the map that we'll use to tell the story of the First World War.
What reasons does England cite for
Not wanting to get involved.
Doesn't Italy say that the treaty didn't apply because Austria was aggressive?
Okay, but like, perhaps we can say that Russia mobilizes its troops against Germany. So really, that should have brought Italy in, right? I think that was pretty clearly part of certainly the spirit of the agreement. Now remember, the Germans everybody's planned for this, right? The French have planned for this, the Germans have planned for this, the Russians have planned for this, everybody's ready to go. This is exactly the war people thought was going to happen, right? And they had planned in many cases for decades for this war, all right? The Schlieffen Plan was just about 10 years old when it was finally put into effect, all right? And remember, what the Schlieffen Plan calls for, here's France, yes, here's Germany, here's Belgium, here's Britain, all right? What the Schlieffen Plan calls for is that German troops are going to come through Belgium where it's flat, oh, here's Paris, all right? And are going to end up attacking Paris from the west, which is exactly the opposite side that one would expect. This is going to be a massive envelopment move, right? Some people call it a sickle attack, because a sickle, which actually probably is most familiar to you from communist flags, that's the curved sword, which you use for cutting down wheat, yeah? You can grab the wheat, all right? So it's going to be a sickle attack. It's going to come around and attack them from behind, as it were. Right? To do this, this requires a huge portion of the German army to be committed to the Western Front, and just a very small portion of the army to remain stationed in the east to defend Eastern Prussia from the Russian assault. If you look at your map, I think it is page, if you look at your map, it's the first map that you have, but it's page, so I guess I'll call it page 9 in your reader. You can see what actually happened with the Schlieffen Plan. And what actually happened with the Schlieffen Plan was that the sickle doesn't go as far. Essentially, the sickle runs, but it comes along this line here, all right? And this is, of course, because it needs to defend its flank. And if you find the army here, you have to curl around, all right? So it's not able to extend itself out as far as it might want to. It was always an ambitious plan, and simply the supply lines get stretched, all right? The conquest of Belgium is by and large successful, all right? The city of Antwerp, which is right here, you can see it on your map, I think. You certainly can see it on your Western Front map, is besieged. Meanwhile, the army, the plan for the army is to sweep around as quickly as possible, all right? Now, after the Russian assault occurs, several divisions are pulled from what might have come out here and are sent over towards the east to defend against what they believe is a more quickly mobilizing Russian army than they believed when the plan was originally created. All right, so the Schlieffen Plan is slightly dialed down at the last minute in a little bit of a fear of Russian engagement, all right, but generally operates more or less as it was planned to operate, all right? But it literally falls short of Paris. And now if you look at your Western Front map, you can see it reaches the Marne River, all right? And we have the Marne River running almost perfectly from Paris, almost perfectly out to the east there. I mean, it wiggles up and down, right? But that is where the French army makes what really feels at the time like a last-ditch stand. All right? Sorry, the Marne River, he said with an American pronunciation. Meanwhile, however, Russian troops invade Germany, exactly like everybody planned that they would. All right? The French, seeing that the overwhelming portion of the Germans are coming on the Western Front, beg the Russians to get involved as quickly as possible to relieve. And in fact, it is in some ways successful because of these 3 divisions that I was telling you about. Divisions change in their number when we talk about different wars in different armies, but they're generally between about 10 and 15,000 men, all right, along with the support that would come along with that. So we can imagine somewhere between 35 and 50,000 soldiers who could have been involved in the assault in France are shifted over towards the Eastern Front. Initially, the Russians make a more impressive than expected assault into Germany, right? And they're coordinating their assault over radio, right? Which is a relatively new technology, especially a new technology in terms of new military technology. The problem with radio, as you guys can probably imagine, like you can always listen to somebody else's radio, all right? So it's important if you're going to use radio, you need to broadcast in code, all right? And your code needs to be pretty complicated, all right? And in fact, the Russians are doing one of these things badly. Sometimes they're coding their messages, but it's an incredibly easy code to decipher, and the Germans do decipher their code almost immediately. And so the Germans are operating with a huge advantage in 1914 when fighting against the Russians, which is that they really do know where Russian troops will be before the Russian troops get there. And that allows them to take what is obviously a huge numerical disadvantage and concentrate their forces in the strategically best place, which is going to be on the flank of their opponents. All right?
Wait, what were the 3 sections you said?
Divisions, yeah.
Divisions? What were they?
There were 3 divisions. So a division is a name for your army is made. The whole army is made up of armies, and armies are made up of divisions. All right? So it would be like saying a class. You have between 10. Sorry?
Is it like a fleet?
It's not like a fleet because that's only ships, right? But so it's it would be like if we were talking about a school, right? Our school is made up of 3 armies, right? It's made up of the lower school army, the middle school army, and the high school army. Those armies are made up of divisions, and so there are 4 divisions that make up the high school: 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. All right? 3 divisions are transferred back to the east, and they end up getting there actually, well, there's a big battle, all right? And just if we're thinking about the big battle gives the Germans the advantage here, all right? Because they know exactly where their troops need to be. And they're fighting on their home soil, all right? So they're able to use the fastest moving technology that they have, railroads, to move their troops from one place to another. Meanwhile, the Russians are fighting in Germany. They're not able to use the railroads, all right? Not all railroads are the same. Germany and Russia use 2 different types of railroads. We call them gauges, but it literally just means that the rails are further apart or more close together. A truly great teacher would be able to tell you whether the Russians were further apart or closer together, but I don't remember, all right? But the Germans, as they retreat from the Russians, all right, and there are 2 kinds of retreat. There's a tactical retreat where you're planning on retreating, and then there's a retreat where you just run away, right? The Germans have a tactical retreat, and when they do, they take every piece of railroad equipment that they can with them. They don't blow up the railroads themselves. They want to plan on using them when they do what's called their counterattack. But they take all of the locomotives, right? Everything that fits on the railroad. So there's literally a moment, right, when the Russian locomotives reach the end of the line, and then they do not function on the German railroads, right? So as the Russian army moves forward, it's powered only by manpower and by horses. All right. Now, this for the entire war, this is going to be the way that the majority of military movement happens: is people walking and horses bringing their stuff with them. All right. And there's certainly people have tried to make like these movies about horses during World War I. This is a compelling story. But the statistic that always sticks in my mind is that more horses died in the fighting of World War I than live in Europe today. But Germany, more than any other country, is going to be able to take advantage of railroads to move people around. And this is especially true in the beginning on the Eastern Front against the Russians. Yes, Sam.
What's the name of the big battle?
Oh yeah, I'm working there. Yep. Although if you want, Sam, I've tried to, as much as possible, highlight the battles I'm going to be talking about on page, I would call it page -1, page 0 of your reader. All right. So if you need any spelling there, if it's not listed there, I'll spell it out. But the battle is going to be called the Battle of Tannenberg.
So they retreat so that they retreat all the equipment so that Russians can't use it.
Yes. And so this is a good part of their military planning. It's a tactical retreat to bring the Russians into an area where they are better able to fight, and right? Soldiers carry a lot of stuff, right? But soldiers don't carry all of their food. They don't carry all of their ammunition. They don't carry extra guns, all right? Your artillery isn't carrying all of the shells it needs to fire. So you have supply lines, which will bring things from back there up to the front lines. And the German tactical retreat forces the Russians to extend their supply lines. All right? And at the Battle of Tannenberg, which is really the first great battle of the war on either the Eastern or the Western fronts, the Russians, knowing nothing about the Germans' intelligence, and I don't mean, intelligence meaning military spying, right? Fall right into a trap where they're able to be enveloped, all right? So they come too far forward towards the Germans. The Germans are able to bring around behind them a large part of their army, all right? And this leads to the mass surrender of Russian troops. An entire army group is surrounded, all right? And so there's a while where the fighting goes on, and fighting when you're being shot at from one side is hard enough. When you're being shot at from 3 sides is quite miserable, all right? And this leads to a mass surrender of Russian troops.
When was that?
All right. That is, so you see right there, right? The Battle of Tannenberg.
Was
That's the Battle of Tannenberg. Is it the 17th and 18th?
26 and 230.
Okay, and on the 30th, I think I have this right, the Russian commander who was in charge of that army group kills himself, all right? It's an absolute horrible disaster for the Russians. On the other hand, because these divisions, right, these maybe 50,000 Germans are dispatched over, it does do what the French wanted, all right? Which is that it does distract the Germans enough so that, and now you can look and you can see our next major event, so that we can see that they are able to take a defensive stand on the Marne River, all right? And they're able to do this partially because of a little bit, I call it a fluke, all right? A little bit of happenstance luck, all right? Airplanes are going to play a very little role in the First World War. They get a lot of press, all right? Maybe you guys have heard about the Red Baron, for example, Baron von Richthofen, who's the World War I ace, all right? in general, airplanes don't play a large role in the war, but they do have a role in terms of reconnaissance, all right? Normally, before the First World War, your reconnaissance was done by your cavalry. You'd send them ahead, find out where the enemy was, and then when the enemy started shooting at you, you'd run back and you'd say, they're over there, they're shooting at us, all right? Now you can do this by airplane, right? And French reconnaissance planes flying out of Paris, all right, see the German army pushing out, all right? And they're able to reveal the sort of intention of the plan, which is just right to do that sneak around the back of Paris. So the French army is able to guide them back towards the east, so that the entire German army ends up, and you can see exactly on, what did I say, is it page 9? You can see exactly on page 9, you can see where the German army, in fact, entirely ends up to the east of Paris, all right? And they end up in a battle with the French troops who dig in to make their last stand along the Marne River, all right? And this is now when we see the Germans, they start to have extended supply lines, all right? They're still able to use French railroads, it's true. But even this, they've reached the limit of their logistical planning, all right? They're not able to rush their troops forward as much as they would like to, and the French are able to make a successful stand on the Marne River, which is sometimes referred to as the miracle on the Marne. All right. So this is the first. This is what stops the Schlieffen Plan, and whatever happens next is going to be something else. All right. So you can see that the battle on the Marne stops the German offensive on the 5th of September. All right. And that's so that's actually kind of easy. We can remember, right? 30 days has September, April, June, and November. Yeah. So that must be the 32nd day of the war. And I always forget this. This is the sort of thing I should look up. Maybe somebody will look it up during our break. But I seem to remember that the Schlieffen Plan called for capturing Paris on day 42. All right. If in fact they're turned back on day 32, you can see that actually was a realistic timetable. In other words, the German war plan works more or less as it's supposed to. It doesn't go as far. It doesn't go as far west as it was supposed to. It works more or less as it was supposed to until it doesn't.
It didn't work as supposed to because the French were able to defend.
They're able to, the French defense is able to, even in retreat, and the British as well. The British fight a noble losing battle in a place called Mons in August. They're able to push the Germans further east than the German planned for. And part of that is because of French and British bravery. Part of that is because of some tactical mistakes which are made by the Germans. Part of that is because of extended supply lines. Part of that is because of the aircraft reconnaissance. All right. All of these things mean that the Germans end up trying to make their final push across a river. All right. Which is kind of the best thing you could have to defend yourself, is forcing people to cross a river. And then if you look at your map, you'll see the hope was you do have to cross a river to get to Paris, right? But the hope was you'd be crossing that river when the enemy wasn't expecting you. The French were always going to defend the Marne very carefully, but if we could sneak around here and attack Paris from behind, that would really relieve the pressure on those Marne defenders. But so that doesn't happen, all right? Now, as soon as, if you look, take a look at your map on page 9, there's a huge gap now between the Germans, yeah? And then there's a huge chunk of France. There's all of this bit, all right? And the most basic aspect of warfare, and I would say like probably the most basic aspect of like fighting in general, is it's easier to fight somebody from the side, all right? So the French, after they've counterpunched, they decide they're gonna force the Germans out by coming around them and hitting them from the side. We've got them held here, we're gonna come around and hit them from the side, right? And the Germans are thinking the same thing. We're gonna come around the French and attack, right? And so everybody starts really, as quickly as they can move troops, they start moving troops to the north and to the west. So you can watch this development of this northwest movement of the armies, all right? And it ends up being called by the British the race to the sea, because you're trying to get ahead, right? You're just trying to get your guy so that you can turn the flank of the enemy, all right? Now, you'll notice when you actually see, when you look at your map, you'll see what actually happened, all right? And you'll see that the Germans were more or less forced directly north. The Germans really don't make it particularly far west, all right? And part of this is because the city of Antwerp is still held by the Belgians, all right? So in order to not be totally able to be attacked from behind, they have to destroy the city, well, destroy the defenses of Antwerp before they can fully race to the sea. So that might be one other aspect that sort of slows them down, all right? But so here we have, now this red line, I took this from a book which was published in the United States in 1915. And so this just shows what the front looked like in 1915. But it's more or less what it looks like in 1914, and it's more or less what it looks like in 1916. One of my favorite things about this map is there are some parts of this map, there are going to be important battles that aren't represented on this map, well, because they didn't know they were going to happen, all right? But it's a nice detailed map, and it gives us what did people think was important almost pre-war, right? It's a pre-war map, and then they just drew this big red line on there, all right? So the race to the sea then moves us to a new phase of the war, because now we essentially have battle lines which stretch from the Channel to the Alps, all right? We have this battle line that stretches from the Channel to the Alps in the west, all right? The English Channel. Now, if you skip forward, you should be able to see, you can see what happens with the race to the sea. We have a nice map of that on page 10. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to turn to page 11 and look at the Eastern Front, all right? And we can basically, the story of the Eastern Front here then is there's a massive German advance into Russia, but there's a successful Russian advance into Galicia, all right, or into Austria-Hungary, all right? So we have sort of a trade-off there. The Austro-Hungarian army is going to prove itself in 1914 to be less effective than anybody planned, all right? Now, we knew going into the war that of all of the great powers, I don't know, are we counting Italy as a great power? I guess we probably are. So not of all of the great powers, but of the major people who you wrote down, of the major combatants in the war, Austria-Hungary was always going to have the weakest military. And people knew that for the previous years because they were just spending the least on their military, all right? They were spending something like 2% of their gross domestic product on military spending, when other major powers were spending right about double that, all right? Now, 4% of GDP doesn't sound like a lot of spending, but remember, military spending doesn't get you anything unless you use it, all right? So 4% of GDP is actually quite high military spending. Yeah.
I didn't hear who did spend a lot of money.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire had lower military spending than other people even during the war, all right? But they're pushed back even by the Serbians in 1914, all right? So their invasion of Serbia is unsuccessful, and you can see here they're also being pushed back by the Russian assault. It's not a failure by any means, but by sort of December 31st, 1914, it's becoming clear that the Austro-Hungarians are not going to be a major factor, all right? Equal partner, all right? Now, in 1914, it doesn't look like the British are going to be a co-equal partner in the war either, all right? They're the only country that has a volunteer army. Their army is very small, right? So the French are definitely bearing the brunt of the Western Front, all right? So if we just think of the major powers, and we think of it as being Britain, France, and Russia against Austro-Hungary and Germany, all right, I'm oversimplifying here, all right? Then the Western Front is one central power fighting against two Entente powers, Germany fighting against Britain and France, Well, in the Eastern Front, it's the opposite. It's one Entente power, Russia, fighting against two Central powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. All right? And in the Western Front, the major of the two powers is France, and in the Eastern Front, the major of the two powers is Germany. All right? And so one final thing I'd like to point out is Germany's, at the end of 1914, is doing exactly what it didn't want to do. It's fighting a prolonged two-front war. Disaster. But there is one advantage. It is easy for Germany to get from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. It is nearly impossible for the Entente to get from the Eastern Front to the Western Front.
Wait, can you repeat that?
It's easy for Germany to move troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front.
Do it in the middle.
Yeah, because they just have they have their own railroads connecting them. All right? It's almost impossible for the Allies to even move stuff, let alone to move people from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, or vice versa. All right? So the Germans are outnumbered, they're literally surrounded, but that's the one counterpoint that we might make to that. The one counterpoint to making it to a two-front war is the Germans are able to shift their men back and forth. And this is going to be a key aspect of their war strategy.
Could Great Britain pass things to Russia over the North Sea? How was Denmark like neutral in the war?
The Germans are able to, the German fleet is able to keep, in general, and we'll talk about the naval battle, but it's a fleet in being. So it's difficult for British, they're able to control the Baltic Sea. So you can come up and around, and you can try to come in up through here, but that's just a much slower and more difficult process.
And Denmark,
Shame.
Yes, you also couldn't remove like the types of munitions that you want, so it's not like moving them by boats.
Absolutely, right? We think about how much faster it would be. Now, there are going to be, for example, later in the war, well, no, even earlier in the war, we see the United States is selling a lot of munitions and stuff, right? And of course, ultimately, literally millions of Americans are going to come across the ocean. But we don't see that same movement here, all right? And so when the Ottoman Empire enters the war, that's very significant because that would cut off the southern route, the southern connection, right? Because we have the Straits, right? Which are now in the hands of the Central Powers. Chris?
Why didn't Germany help Austria-Hungary militarize if they were planning for war for so long?
Do you mean between like 1906 and 1914, why weren't they?
Yeah, like France did with Russia.
Yeah. I don't know the answer, Chris. That would be an awesome thing to research, would be to research German impact on Austro-Hungarian military spending in between 1910 and 1914, right? I think that would be a really interesting thing to research. And actually, you would be uniquely qualified for that because of your knowledge of German, right? That would be something that you would be, because probably that's obscure enough that you might be needing to look at some primary sources. So that would go beyond many historians' ability, but you'd be able to do that. So do that.
You said that the British.
You can present on Monday.
You said that the British were not like a big factor in the beginning of the war.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to give them some credit for the Battle of Mons, which helps to turn the Germans. But yeah, their army is just so much smaller.
But weren't they like one of the first to militarize? And
I think you're thinking back to the claim that we made that they mobilized their fleet very early, but they simply don't have a large army at this point. So it's called the British Expeditionary Force, and the British have no reason to have a large standing army. Good?
like all the other countries, like Denmark, the Netherlands, were they neutral in the war?
Sorry?
The other countries, like Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, all those countries, they were neutral, or they were backing different powers.
I'd like to add them in, but out of the war. Yeah? Not involved in the war, not sending troops here.
I don't understand, like, why was the involvement of the Ottoman Empire?
Why was that significant? because if you were the British or the French, it would be tempting if you wanted to help your Russian allies to send troops around to Russia this way, right? But the Central Powers control these straits, so you can't. You can't get, okay? Yeah.
What was Luxembourg like doing caught in the crossfire?
Nothing, yeah.
Were they just like, for lack of a better word, chilling?
I wouldn't describe anybody who was involved in the First World War as chilling. I don't know anything about Luxembourgian casualty figures. They're a little bit lucky because the battle line ends up being down here in France and not, in fact, in Luxembourg, but they're occupied.
Hadn't Germany sent troops to Turkey before the war? So like they had a little bit of control there to prevent troops from going from France.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest development is that the Germans, the advisor to the Sultan, the military advisor to the Sultan is German. So Germany already had influence in Constantinople at that point. All right. The British are not doing nothing, though. They declare the North Sea to be a war zone, and on the 2nd of November, they begin their blockade of Germany. All right? So that the British Navy. So if we were saying, well, why? So yes, the Germans can probably prevent things from coming in and out of the Baltic, but the British Navy is able to prevent any trade coming into Germany. All right? So this means that Germany is going to need to fight, and the Central Powers are going to need to fight the war essentially using European resources. All right? Because there are 3 ways you can get to Germany: Suez Canal. We can imagine that you could come through the Mediterranean, up through the Adriatic, and up through Austria-Hungary, all right? Or through the North Sea. All of those are going to be closed off by the British and French navies, all right? Starting very early in the war, just in November, all right? This was actually kind of a controversial move to close off the seas to free trade from non-belligerent powers, right? Why shouldn't Argentinian merchants be able to sell their goods to both sides in the war, all right? So, and I would just point out it was controversial enough, the British don't do this on August 4th, right? This waits until November. Nowadays, it feels, I think, to us, like a really natural thing to do. That would be the first thing you would do. In fact, us now today, we would do this before we went to war. If you don't get out of Belgium, we will blockade you, right? We'll put sanctions on you. This is a pre-war step, all right? But that was not the mentality in 1914, right? This was possibly a criminal action to prevent non-belligerents from sailing around.
Germany didn't do anything to try and unblock that situation.
They will try to do something, but what that something would do would be one of 2 things, right? They could bring out their navy and try to sink the British Navy. That would be thing 1, right? Or they could use submarines to try to sink the British Navy, or more likely, to institute their own blockade, all right? And that's one of the things that's going to happen right early in 1915. The Germans are going to begin using their submarines as a sort of, well, literally as an underwater navy, all right? I'd like to, now, we know the war is going to go until 1918, all right? And a lot of people think, like, I think we can get trapped into everybody thought the war would be over by Christmas. Sometimes people think that, all right? We hear that over and over and over. Or we can kind of think, oh, well, it's going to be a 4.5-year war. I think the truth is probably somewhere in between those 2, all right? And I think at almost every moment, I believe that there were powerful people in both countries who believed the war was going to end very soon, okay? So the war feels to me, even though it ends up being a long war where very little land changes hands, even in the East, where kind of a lot of land changes hands. It was a very fine balance. Right? And just as one example of how fine a balance it is, you'll see that first date I gave you from 1915 is called the Constantinople Agreement. All right? And now that the Ottoman Empire has entered the First World War, the British, French, and Russians meet to discuss what they'll do with the Ottoman Empire post-war. All right? And the key part of that agreement that I'd like to highlight for you, because the rest of it is going to be altered, the key part of that agreement is that it's agreed by the French and by the British that after the war, the Russians will be given control over Constantinople and over the Straits. All right?
Yeah.
So we've sung the song, right? This is a major reversal of British policy. And we sang the song, and now I'm pointing this out to show you how very scary things looked to British and French war planners in the winter of 1915. It really did seem like the Russians might make a separate peace with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. It really seemed like Russia might be knocked out of the war. If we said Austria-Hungary was unimpressive, everybody knew Austria-Hungary was going to be unimpressive. Russia, though, was supposed to gather steam as they moved forward. Does anybody know how to say steamroller in German? They were supposed to be a steamroller that started very slow, but then became irresistible. All right? And this is almost the opposite of the way the Russian army presented themselves in 1914. They started off very quickly and then became incredibly weak. Yep.
When did the Ottomans join the war?
Oh gosh, I forget the date, Sam, but I welcome you to.
29th of October.
Thank you.
1915, the plan from the German perspective is to hammer the Eastern Front. All right? They reverse Schlieffen plan. We can't fight a two-front war. Who seems easier to beat? The Russians. Let's beat the Russians quickly. All right? And for the French and for the British, 1915 is going to be a major, major assault. All right? This is when we're going to push the Germans out of France. So the French launch a major attack. And this is the first, well, anything you say about first, well, I guess I'm going to be right about some first things. Perhaps this is an exaggeration, but it's close enough to be the truth to be what you remember. All right? Which is that the first real trench-on-trench battle happens in 1915 because the armies spend the winter digging in their trenches. And now we start to see kind of what trenches look like. So we might just take a quick look there then. If you guys were to turn, I have to have you skip ahead, but you have to skip ahead all the way to page 18.
Good.
All right, you can see kind of what trenches look like. All right, and if you're looking carefully at what trenches look like, all right, page 18, it's page also says page 57. All right, you can see there's not just one trench, there's a network of trenches. All right, and the trenches are moving back and forth like this.
So,
All right, and this is because the major way that people are killed throughout the entire First World War is not by bullets, but by artillery. All right, by large cannons which are firing shells. All right, the purpose then of trenches is to protect you from these shells that are being fired. All right, and now I'd like you to think just for a second. If you think, what are the wars I can picture before the First World War? What are the wars I can picture before the First World War? For me as an American, the most obvious war before the First World War that I have a good picture of is the American Civil War. all right, from 1861 to 1865, all right? And I think about what people are wearing, all right? I don't know if you can picture Civil War soldiers. If you can, though, try to picture what they're wearing on their heads, right? They're just wearing little caps on their heads, right? Okay? Now, if we picture World War I soldiers, everybody's wearing a metal hat, super uncomfortable, all right? It shifts around, it's just held on by a leather strap, right? It's moving around, it can get in your eyes. It's a really bad piece of military equipment, all right? The German ones are a tiny bit better, all right? The only reason you wear a metal cap, all right, is because the thing that's killing you is coming from above you, all right? So we needed these when we were fighting in the Middle Ages when people were shooting their bows and arrows up at us, right? And we needed it when we were worried about somebody coming up behind us and hacking us with an axe. Yeah, that was good. But then for hundreds of years, we didn't need to have metal hats anymore because people were shooting at us and they were shooting at us from right there, okay? And there wasn't any practical armor you could wear that was gonna stop a bullet, all right? But so then once again, we move, so it's easy to think, I think it's easy to think that the reason why people dig into trenches is because they're trying to hide from bullets, all right? Because every war movie we think, we picture the machine gun set up, right? But actually the point of trenches is so that you can hide from shrapnel, which is what happens when a shell explodes and it sends essentially thousands of bullets flying in every direction. All right, and so if you're worried about artillery, you don't want to have a straight line here, all right? Because then once the artillery hits you once here, they already know the distance they have to fire. Then they just shift their gun 1 degree and then they hit you here, hit you here, hit you here. This makes it so that it's always a different distance that they have to fire into. And if enemy troops get in, you sure don't want them to come in and just be able to shoot down your whole trench, right? So that this makes that impossible too. And you can see this is a technology that both sides adopted, all right? And this, even though this map that you have here is from July 1916, this is more or less what the trenches looked like in 1915 as well, all right? And so in the French assault, all right, the first major get out of the trenches, all right, and walk, or in this case, run towards the enemy, all right? It's just a disaster, all right? The French lose 200,000 men, all right? And this is in the spring of 1915. It's called the Battle of Champagne. And the Germans only lose 80,000 men. Now, only lose, right?
And this is because of the trenches?
This is because of the nature of trench warfare in 1915 gives, and now we can literally like run the numbers, right? But it gives something like a 2.25 advantage to the defender, all right?
But then, so how did France get weaker?
How do you mean?
Because you said in the Battle of Champagne,
Because the French are attacking. The French decide they're going to punch
so
through the
Germany-
German trenches.
okay, so, okay, got it.
Okay, and so here we see really this first big attempt to break through trenches ends in a horrible disaster. All right.
The trenches, are the Germans able to fight back?
Yes.
How? Like, not all of them are in the trenches.
Sorry.
If they're in the trenches, how can they?
So the depth of trenches kinds of changes depending on where you are. But trenches have what are called parapets. So your trench, the front of your trench might look like that. So here's where you picture people walking, but you can climb up a ladder and be here, and then you might have a machine gun here that's firing out across at the enemy. All right? And you have your men there ready and firing across at the enemy. And then you have back here, way far away, you have your artillery, which is firing at the enemy. All right?
France wasn't in trenches.
The French were in trenches as well. Everybody dug in 1915. But to attack somebody, obviously you have to leave your trenches.
So they were in no man's land.
Yeah, no man's land. That's what we call the area in between, right? In between the trenches.
We tried to launch.
Yeah, backfired is hard because it's not like they do gain some, like they take over some area, but it's quickly taken back. So it's a totally unsuccessful attack, where hundreds of thousands of people die for no tactical gain.
So they left their trenches when the Northerners got shot by Germans.
Yeah, although, I mean, just get shot. I mean, it goes on for many days, and they do capture some German trenches. It's just they can't hold them, and so then they're forced out again.
Don't they have grenades?
Sure, and remember and then artillery is firing the biggest grenades there are, right? They just aren't effective at totally clearing out a trench.
But so as the French lose 200,000 men, do the German counterattack something?
The Germans do counterattack, but only so much as to regain what is lost. All right. Meanwhile, the Germans are planning their own counterattack further to the north. And do you see this little area up here in the very north part? It's YPRES. It's right near the B in Belgium. Okay. Alex, how would you pronounce that in French?
I can't see it.
Or Clement? It's right near the B in Belgium. It's what? Ypres. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. So that's how you say it. But this is part of the British sector. All right. So it's important for you guys to know that the British usually call this wipers. All right. Okay. And we're going to fight a series. This is actually the second time that a battle has been fought at Ypres. All right, so we actually say this is the second Battle of Ypres. All right, this is the first time that German troops used poison gas. All right, they release poison gas before they leave their own trenches.
So when was the second battle of Ypres?
The second Battle of Ypres, and it's on your timeline, which I gave you. That's also in the middle of 1915.
Wait, so
All right, so that starts in the spring. It starts in April.
the French make the offensive, but they don't gain a lot of territory.
Right. So the Champagne is just a horrible disaster
In all ways possible.
in all ways possible. The German offensive in 1915 is not actually supposed to be super offensive, because remember, the Germans are planning on pushing the Russians out in the east. But they do use a new technology, which is this poison gas. All right? The Germans use the poison gas. But it's really experimental. All right? So it doesn't lead to a major breakthrough.
Was it brand new, like, was the gas brand new to the war, or was it just the first time the Germans used it?
It was brand new to the war. Nobody had used gas before the Second Battle of Ypres. The British, meanwhile, recognizing this problem, have a plan to capture Constantinople. Right? And you can now, if you turn to on your map, to page 14. This should take us through the end. So British troops, and especially the British Empire, all right, especially troops from Australia and New Zealand, land on the southern tip here, all right, in a campaign which is going to be called the Gallipoli campaign, all right? And so the landing takes place in April, then there's a secondary landing in August. All right. This is also a horrible disaster, all right, where Turkish forces are able to pin down the British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces on the beach. And it's incredibly difficult to dig in and defend yourself. Bernardo.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. Is the battle of
Yeah, or you can say wipers and just be British.
Wiper result in German win?
It didn't. But and some people use that to demonstrate that gas wasn't effective. And as it turns out, gas is almost never going to be effective in the war in terms of allowing you to capture enemy trenches. It's just not reliable enough to really punch a hole in the enemy. It it ends up being successful at killing enemy soldiers. So there's going to be, we're going to move in 1916, so here's your preview of next year. We're going to move towards a moment when we have, it doesn't seem like you have to take land so long as you kill enough of the enemy soldiers. So in that sense, gas is useful. But in terms of tactically advancing the battle line, gas is never super successful. But we don't actually learn that in 1915 because the Germans don't try to take advantage of it. This is much more of an experiment for them. And if you actually look at what the Germans do in 1915, right? They'd already occupied the black bit here. Look at how far they're able to advance in. And why didn't the Germans help the Austro-Hungarians in 1913? Yeah, that's what you're going to find out for us. But they sure helped them in 1915. Look at all that territory that's recovered down there in the south. All right? So 1915 has got to feel like a very successful year for the German army.
I'm confused as to why the military landings in Turkey are important.
Why they're important?
And why did they do it?
Why did they do it? They did it because if you can capture this, you're going to be able to link up the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Sorry?
Okay.
Right? Because you can come up here, and then all of a sudden, you're coming up and you're connected to Russia again. All right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's important because it's a horrible disaster. All right? It's poorly planned. It's poorly executed. All right? And it's the most important holiday in terms of like military holiday for New Zealand or for Australia. And also, and this is a larger term historical significance, the civilian who's most responsible for the planning is the First Lord of the Admiralty, all right? Winston Churchill. So we're going to hear about him later. But this is going to come up again and again and again in the 1930s. This is what Churchill was going to be remembered for if he hadn't been prime minister in 1940, which is to say the disaster at Gallipoli, all right? And this is the first big major British disaster of the war. This war is going to have disasters for everyone, but this is an indelible sort of stain.
And speaking of like future world leaders, Adolf Hitler is at the Second Battle of Ypres. He's going to be hit by a gas attack in 1918. He literally has begun his war experience at that Second Battle of Ypres. He's a corporal in the German army. So like that's his first World War experience.
His first World War experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Didn't Winston Churchill, did he resign after the Gallipoli campaign or?
He's shifted. Churchill actually is going to serve in the army for a bit, and he's going to be shuffled around. He discredited, though. The major shift is going to happen in 1916.
If the British had taken over Turkey, they would, in theory, after the war, give it back to Russia because of Constantinople.
Yes.
So, if when Britain went there, didn't Russia was like, you're gonna take my territory?
No. The Russians wanted this. They had the deal. This is good. This is even better. This shows you how much the British were worried about this situation. They were going to take Constantinople and then give it to the Russian Shah of Constantinople. Okay.
Like what? I didn't get that.
You know, we sang the song, The Russian Shah of Constantinople. So the thing we really couldn't have imagined in 1877 was that the British would capture Constantinople and then give it to the Russians. But that's exactly what they're trying to do at Gallipoli. Keep the Russians in the war. And look at that map that you have on page 15. There you go, you're there. Okay? Look at those arrows where you see the German and Austro-Hungarian armies pushing into Russia at that point. This feels like a critical moment in the war. The British also launch their first assault in the West, all right? This is the battle called Loos, L-O-O-S. If you look at your map right here, that's a little mining town just north of Lens. All right.
Lens.
Yes, Lens. Right?
When was that?
That all happens in the fall, so the battle loses in September. Usually when we talk about men lost, we talk about casualty figures, which means killed, wounded, or missing. Because if somebody's killed, wounded, or missing, they can't fight anymore. All right? So the Battle of Loos is also a great disaster for the British. So if we think about this, 14 is German assault, 50 on the Western Front, 15 is Entente assaults, all right? The German assault is unsuccessful in 1914. The Entente assaults are unsuccessful in 1915, all right? For almost all of the major powers, 1916 is going to be the bloodiest year of the war. So that'll be the preview, and that's what we'll cover, in our next class. Not for France. For France, 1915 is the bloodiest year of the war, all right? 350,000 Frenchmen, not wounded, not missing, killed in 1915. 350,000, right? Do we remember who can find me the population of France in 1914? 60? Right? Because this is the thing we remember, it was 60 million in 1871, and then had not yet turned to 61, but however Remarque describes it for us. Alex, you're checking though?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's 67 million.
67 million? Cool. I'm going to divide that by 2 really quick, okay? Because I figure half the people are men, all right? So that's...
It would be more 68 actually, because it's 67.7.
Okay? 39 million men, all right? This is from age 1 to 100, yeah? Okay? What percentage of them are just simply die in battle in 1915? Fully 1% of the population, right? Right? It's unbelievable the bloodletting in France. Another really interesting thing would be for us to look, if someone was doing a research project, to look at French morale on the home front in 1915. I'd love to see that. All right. The other major development I'd like to give you of 1915 is that Serbia finally collapses under Austro-Hungarian pressure. All right, and Serbians are either captured or leave Serbia.
But weren't Austro-Hungary pushed out of Serbia?
Initially, they were in 1914, but they keep going. They're reinforced by some German commanders, and they're able to capture Serbia by the end of 1915.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
First, I'm confused with the Battle of Lens. What did it do?
Not the Battle of Lens. Sorry, you think that my pronunciation is so bad. Lens is the nearest town, but just north of Lens is a mining town called.
Oh.
Yes, and that's the first big British battle of the war.
Oh, British battle. Okay.
Yeah.
And
because I study history in English, we overemphasize the British role in the war.
Okay, and the bloodshed in 1916 for the
15.
1915.
Yeah.
Oh, 1915.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We haven't gotten to 1916 yet.
Wait, the Battle of Loos, was that before or after the one Churchill lost?
After. Well, Gallipoli's going on from April to December. December, they finally evacuate the troops, but Loos takes place in September.
But then that wasn't the first big battle.
Just for the British. We're going to ultimately, different nations have different war experiences, and Loos is the first time where the British are like, here's our plan, here's what we're going to do, we're going to punch through, right? Which is what the French wanted to do in the spring, the Germans do in the fall, and they also fail.
But then the Gallipoli battle?
Also a failure, but Gallipoli, remember, is way over here.
Oh, you're talking about in Europe.
Yes, exactly. Come on.
Didn't the French do 4 minutes ago now?
In terms of a battle, certainly. I think the French casualties, and I have the advantage of I have 2 hours before our next class, so I can check. But I think French casualties at Verdun are something like 350,000. Casualties, that's killed, wounded, and missing. It's 350,000 dead forever, because that's how being dead works, in 1915. So, but that's what's so crazy, like that, because for most people, the Western Front is 1916, and that's where we're going to start our next class with. For most people, that's the whole focus of the war. And that's an inaccurate representation of the French experience. The French did 1915 and then came back and did 1916. So like it's the way that people speak about the French military, right? Like there are all these just ridiculous jokes like, why are there trees along the Champs-Élysées so that like the Germans can march in the shade? It's just like nothing could be further from the truth, right? The French are fighting at home, right? They have a horrible 1914, an absolutely devastating 1915, and then they come back and they do Verdun. It's unbelievable, unbelievable.
But how did they use so many men in 1915?
Assaults on trenches.
Was 200,000 only in
In the Battle of Champagne. They have 200,000 casualties just in the Champagne offensive. Yep.
In the timeline, it says that Italy declared war on Austria.
Yep. I have 4 minutes and 2 things I want to tell you about. All right. Obviously, which side Italy is going to come in on feels like they're going to be able to tip the balance. All right. And so both sides are trying to negotiate to have them come in. The British negotiate with the Italians, and you can see here in the spring, right, if we're on page 12, you can see the territory that the British and French offered to the Italians, and it's in black here. It's quite a bit of Austria-Hungary, all right? This is secret, this is a secret protocol, but they offered to give this to them if they'll enter the war. So the Russians are sort of bribed to stay in the war, and the Italians are bribed to get into the war. 1915 was supposed to be the end of the war. All right? We're going to hit them in the east. We're gonna take over Constantinople. Italy's gonna come in, right? Everything we have is gonna, and that's not the way that it works at all. Germany, meanwhile, is using its U-boats, all right? And Germany sinks an American ship, which is called the Lusitania.
Is that the one that some people say that like the Americans?
Sorry?
Is that the one that like some people have these like conspiracy theories? That, like,
Well, the accusation is there are hundreds of American citizens on board. Period. The accusation that the Germans say is any ship that's going towards Britain, we're going to consider that it's carrying weapons. And you're not allowed to bring weapons to Britain, and so we're going to sink your ship. So they sink the Lusitania. And my understanding is, in fact, the Lusitania did have military supplies on it, as well as American citizens. All right? So it wasn't a military ship, but it was carrying military supplies, right? So Germany is using its submarines, and this is, obviously you don't want the United States to get involved in the war. That would be a disaster, all right? So 1915 ends then with the question of what will happen. And now we're set up for a very interesting development, which is everybody's gonna try to end the war in 1916. The Russians are gonna do an offensive, the British are going to do an offensive, the French are going to do an offensive, the Germans are going to do an offensive. Everybody's going to end the war in 1916 because boy, can this not go on any longer. All right? Christmas 1915, I think this is an exaggeration, I think many people believed the war was going to be decided in the next year. You would do yourself a huge favor if you could find yourself 10 minutes between now and our next class to just reflect on 1914, 1915 without looking at your notes, all right? What are the big things that stand out to you, all right? If you can just start to tell yourself the story. Maybe it's just the story of 14 is a Central Power offensive in the West, 15 is defensive, right? Maybe you think of it just from a Central Powers. Central Powers, 14 is West, 15 is East. Maybe you think of it that way, right? Maybe you think of it as, what are the Allies doing in 15? You think of all the, what is the Entente doing in 1915? What are they grabbing for? But tell yourself a little story in those two sections. Fantastic. I'll see you guys back here at 1:40. Enjoy the tacos. They're delicious.
Oh, it's awesome. Meeting.
Yeah.